Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with more Hearts of Iron 3 with Black Ice 9.11, and of course we are playing as Nihon, Japan, the land of the rising sun. So let's continue this. Just before starting the episode, I was taking a look at some of my forces. Fortunately, most are as reserve status, so they're not at full strength until we go to war and mobilize. But I was looking sort of at these and thinking that maybe, okay, we can upgrade a few of these units to motorized or semi-motorized type things to get them a little bit faster. Sort of what I'm thinking, hoping, considering. So we have the tanks that are, well, they're only, the heavy tanks are only 4.2, so maybe it's not worth it. These are the infantry tanks. Japan's armor really sucked. We give them money for energy, okay, just because we want them friendly. Oh, I probably canceled the... Oh, you want some Japanese goods? Great. And the US, yes, great. I think it was the Datsun, that Japan was right around this time. Fine. Was trying to sell in Australia. I remember seeing a little bit about that. So that is fairly historical, selling finished goods to some place like Australia. And you have to, one thing you sort of need to remember at the time, and I guess still to this day, is Japan and Australia drive on the wrong side of the road like Britain does. So it's not, well, you have to make a different production run. It's not too hugely hard, but you know, to make other automobiles that have the, you know, steering wheel on the other side, say for export to the US, I have to wonder. No, like I say, it's not too hard, and if they really thought they were going to sell a bunch, I'm sure, not obviously, eventually post-war, they you know, well post-war, that's sort of in the 70s, but they sell a lot of automobiles to the US. But where with some place like Australia, and I presume New Zealand at the time, you can just sell unaltered cars. And that kind of thing is, you know, good. So, yes, we are overproducing supplies. What we're needing. Without much additional work, because there probably wasn't a lot of, you know, we all want health and safety, but how regulated do we want to be? I watch a fair amount of British documentaries. I have to circumvent certain things to be able to watch them here in America because they're normally restricted, at least on the normal click on the BBC or whatever, watch, you know, watch on demand kind of things to IP addresses in Britain, but I find a way to get them. And we got these guys on boats on the Thames River or some other place, and they're wearing these life jackets, and they're on camera, and the people around, and they're on a boat in a river or on a lake, and they're wearing a life jacket. And I'm not saying it's a government law, but it may be like a BBC health and safety, because I understand they have a lot, within their corporation, a lot of health and safety regulations. And I'm not saying it's like something so extreme that if you were dressing as an 18th century sailor to be on camera out on there, they would force you to do it. But it seems like a bit of an overkill. And we would give them money for fuel. No, thank you. Okay. We want their good relations. And I watch, oh, now we're selling a lot of these, so let's up our supplies production. Always good to have plenty of supplies production. Riding horses in Britain, wearing helmets. And to me, that just seems sort of ridiculous. And it seems so prevalent that it seems to be a some sort of government regulation. Now, if you're jumping horses, jumping over fences and whatever, so you have a lot higher chance of falling off, being thrown, whatever. Yeah, and I have been. Well, probably I fell off more than was thrown off of a horse when I was very young. But in America, wearing a hat. Now, mostly we wear cowboy hats, and now there's a lot of, American mythos and movie stuff and whatever behind, some of the fashion statements. But yeah, a cowboy hat compared to, say, like a baseball cap or some other work cap, you will see people wearing, I'm sure, riding horses, but not so much. Because a cowboy hat has a lot of volume to it, and it's fairly stiff, so it keeps the sun off of you and can keep the rain off of you, though where I was riding horses, it rarely rained, normally called a desert. But, I mean, not too deserty, but it has crumple zones, shall we say, meaning it's fairly stiff, and as you fall off the horse and you land, now if you happen to be so unlucky as to hit your head right on a hard piece of rock or something like that that's sticking way up, you might have a serious problem. But mostly, you have a crumple zone, and it slows up the impact and that kind of thing, and it's just fine. And you don't want to look like a complete idiot, which I sort of take those people who wear the helmets to look like complete idiots just for simply riding a horse. And so, like, cars is where I was starting out. There probably wasn't a lot of, especially back then, and how many years did I drive around in a car without any safety glass in it? Safety glass shatters into, like, a million pieces, so it doesn't cut you when it, it breaks the skin, but it doesn't, no big dangerous shards. And then, I'm all for that kind of stuff in cars. Or it's the type that, it's like windshields, that it sort of stays together because it's laminated. Well, I drove around, my parents collected old cars, so I drove as a kid for many years, from cars in the 30s and whatnot, and didn't have any of this stuff. And people had gruesome accidents way back then, and but it's just, where do you draw the line? You want some level of safety regulations. I do want some level of that kind of stuff. But it was probably a situation where the cars, however, that they looked okay type cars for the 1930s. That the Japanese were making, they probably didn't have to modify them at all to sell them in Australia. Just ship them down there. Okay. Our artillery brigades have advanced. Great. And we can do that, but I think we're still in the red here. So we won't. I think that is, yes, grayed out here, right? So. Yeah, I know. Azaz lives in India and stuff, but everything I see in India makes me, if I was going to drive around in India, I'd want to drive around in a tank, and not because it has a gun on it, though that might be useful when you're frustrated with traffic jams, but just the crazy drivers and whatnot in India is just, that just to the extreme in the other direction. So, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm looking at this. We'll keep an eye on that. We're not even in 37 yet, I know, but I don't want to be too low when we do, because we do have an earlier war start that I'm used to with Germany. Which I'm going to be very, very interested in to see how it goes with China. Because whenever, I mean, sure, I've, observed how Japan does in other playthroughs and games, and often Japan, not with hard China though, but wins eventually in China and whatnot. And my anticipation is wherever I really decide to attack, concentrate some forces, I should be able to win. I may have to do a bunch of, as the fronts get larger and larger, use garrisons and other lighter forces just to hold the front line in other places. Okay, 1936, with the radical factions within the Japanese military discredited following the February 26 incident, Hirota was selected to replace Okada as Prime Minister of Japan. Let's pull up the politics. So we, Fumimaro, or Kanoe Fumimaro, I thought was the current. Yeah, but this is going replace Okada as Prime Minister. However, Hirota placated the military by reinstating a system by which only active duty Navy or Army or Navy officers could serve as cabinet posts of the War Ministry or the Navy Ministry. The military had abused this system in the past to bring down civil governments. In terms of foreign policy, the Anti-Comintern Pact with the Nazis and Fascist Italy was signed during his premiership. This treaty was the predecessor to the Tripartite Pact. Okay, and I know I think I mentioned this somewhat when I was doing, and I'm sorry if I'm mentioning stuff too often when it sort of comes up, but I am a bit confused. Did I say this in my Hearts of Iron 4 series or not? And when did I last talk about the subject? But okay. You have the emperor at the top. You have sort of his sort of clique of advisors, but then you have government ministers who run their ministries. And to a large extent, they are sort of doing their own thing. Now, this most clearly shows up in my mind with the military and the Navy, but the Army and the Navy. But it is, to my understanding, also other things. This is as opposed to a situation in which you have in the U.S. sort of cabinet system in which the president appoints all of the cabinet ministers, and all they got to do, and all they're supposed to do, is just be advised and consent by the Senate. The Senate's supposed to, like, yeah, make sure the guy, is reasonably competent, not corrupt, and whatever. Then the president gets who he wants. Nowadays, there are, playing all kinds of politics with it. But, and it's always a political thing, but, just to make sure that it's, the idea is that if he's elected, he doesn't get to just appoint all of his friends, and then if they're incompetent, well, you can't get rid of them unless I don't know if you can impeach a secretary in the U.S. departments. I don't know if you can impeach that. Maybe you can. I'm not sure. But that's really hard to do. In a lot of other governments, you have the heads of the ministries are really sort of controlled by the prime minister. Normally within, I'm thinking mostly in Britain right now, but Nazi Germany is a bit different, but somewhat like that. Mostly within the consultations of the leadership of the political party in power. So the government often works towards the same ends. this is not necessarily the case in Japan. So that you can get ministries that are not necessarily working at cross purposes because they have different spheres of influence, but they're sort of doing their own thing and they have their own power bases. And again, I'm heavily, because I know it best about the Navy and the Army, but I do believe it's also other ministries as well. Within the Army and the Navy, well, within the ministries, you had to be you had to be a serving officer, but mostly to get, Ministry of War, which goes to the Army, and then the Navy Ministry, which is a much lesser status, goes to the Navy. You had your own power base within either the Army or the Navy. And during the 30s, there were at times that a general, say, would become Minister of War and give up his post wherever, his active command, some region of Japan's military command, or I don't know, First Fleet's unit or whatever within the Navy. You gave that up to do full-time, be the minister. Well, once you did that, you sort of lost your power base within the military, so you often became weak within that. So as time goes on, the serving officers that would be either war minister or Navy minister also kept their important commands as well, so that they were doing double duty. And so all of the like people under you wanting to get promoted and get good jobs and whatnot were still looking to you, and so they would give you your support. Now, they talk about bringing down the government. So for a while this was, for a while it wasn't, and then it's now back from about this time into the end of the war, very much until the end of the war. You have to be a general or an admiral to be in one of those cabinet posts. Well, it gets to one point that the Army, under one of the prime ministers, just talks to itself and says no general accepts the post. And so the not just under any, it was just zero conditions under this prime minister, no one is going to be post. So it brings down the government. So this is a complete veto power, disregarding whatever the political elections, and there were elections for not for prime minister, but for the Diet or whatever the parliament was. Vetoes the emperor, because often the emperor is selecting prime ministers for various reasons. And so this brings down the government, and this is why you can get the Army, say, doing stuff that are you can have a foreign ministry that could be say, trying to improve relations with France. And then you could have the Army attacking a French concession in China. So that, well, the Army doesn't care what the foreign ministry and foreign relations diplomatic strategy for Japan is. It's going to do its own thing. So completely potentially at odds with what the Japanese diplomats of the Japanese government are trying to do. So this really creates an unstable situation internally and externally within the government. And this is, again, sort of when I'm saying this, is that you have Japanese diplomats going and doing their own thing that aren't necessarily consulting other departments. And this can, so this gives a non-unified setting. In the United States, we are currently under, we have something like this that was not happening under Obama, but happened somewhat under Bush, and definitely is happening under Trump, is because our State Department is made of careerists. And long ago, it's been a combination of people who are trying to build a certain a certain status quo and promoting like-minded people. Oh yeah, Bob's a good guy. He seems to have his head screwed on right. Well, as it's a lot of these people who go in government are left-leaning, so you have a sort of left-leaning State Department that its sort of highest goal, if you will, is stability within the world. And then you get a president like George Bush or like Trump that wants to go in a different direction, so that you often get massive amounts of obstruction within the State Department achieving some ends. So you have this problem, and it is in the United States incredibly hard in a practical sense to fire a government employee. Just incredibly hard. I don't know if murder would get you. Being actually convicted and going to prison on murder would probably get you fired. But I'm being a little joking here, but not so much. I mean, there's a lot of crimes that you could be charged with, and if they can't quite convict, but everybody knows, it's really hard to get you fired from a government job, both federally and at lower levels. Because I know I mentioned this in another episode of something recently, in which state of California did or had somebody do sort of an inspector general's report of various state departments, the state agricultural department, or the Department of Motor Vehicles and whatnot, and sort of gone through. And they found one woman who for a few years would come into, she worked for the DMV, and this wouldn't surprise anybody really who ever has to go into the DMV. That's the Department of Motor Vehicles, where you get your driver's license. That she would routinely, for multiple hours during the day, sleep at her desk and or at her window or whatever, for supposed to be dealing with the public. So she'd come in and put her head down and sleep. And after doing this for a few years, they decide to move her to still in the DMV, but to a job that doesn't require her to interact with the public. Don't fire you. And no, this isn't like my cousin was telling me about. He works for a major petrochemical company, and it has branches in many parts of the world. And they get interns, as they call them, coming to the headquarters in Texas. And these interns are interns in this, then that they're company employees, but they're not. They're full employees, but they're not normally at sort of the head office, and they come there to get some sort of training and experience, on the job working kind of stuff, before they go back to their country and do jobs in their country that they may have already been doing, just building, training them, how to do their job, but also building a corporate sense of identity. That kind of thing. Well, one guy from Asia, I don't know if he specified, but it could be Japan or somewhere, was sort of caught with his head down on his desk, sleeping for a little while during the day. And he says the company is very inclusive and doesn't want to rock the boat or whatever. Well, And it was sort of, and he didn't go into too much detail on it, but sort of explained that, well, in his part of the world, people often sleep at their desk because they work such long hours, and will often work hours much greater because they're often salaried or whatever, meaning they get a weekly or monthly paycheck, not based on how many hours they work, but just that they have the job. They often work much more than the, say, standard 40 hours a week to keep their job going. So the idea of taking an hour or two's nap in the middle of the day is culturally appropriate because you get your job done and you're often seen working, getting to work early and staying late. So this kind of thing, but sort of shocked the people in Texas that somebody would do this. And he said, oh yeah, this guy is definitely a really hard worker, and is much more in that sort of a thing. So you do have things that are appropriate in some areas, and that these are hard workers, and they want these employees, where this is the government's hard to get rid of them. So it's like I say, it's really hard to get rid of government employees in the U.S. once you sort of get the job. And so you have a lot of these people in the various embassies doing various work, and then the president nominates, and the Senate approves the ambassadors. And so the ambassadors often show up to a country and have a different program than the people that have been working there for 10 years. And sometimes it's the opposite program. One thing that is a big issue in the U.S. is abortion, and some people believe abortion is murder, and this isn't, and I really would prefer you not, and I'm not giving you my opinion. You may presume you know mine, but I'm not giving mine, and you probably you may be mistaken. But this isn't, but the big issue is, some people believe it's murder, some people don't believe it's murder, and it's just, the woman's right to choose, and okay, I get all that. But there's also a lot of people in America that don't believe the government should be paying for this, and don't believe the government should pay for this to happen outside of the United States. That the U.S. government money should go to it. Well, there's been, under different presidents, different programs to help different stuff overseas. So sometimes they may be helping to pay for abortions in other countries. You get a new pro-life person in, and he wants to stop and fight this program to turn it around. And the president agrees. So you often have this friction. But it is nothing, to my understanding, like the friction that was going on in Japan. It's just a much more extreme. I know I'm talking about this for a bit, but I think it's important to understand. Where you have with Italy or Germany, you have a very directed policy matters. And we've talked a lot about Germany, how they often have competing agencies doing things, but it's all towards the greater National Socialist vision. And in Britain, you have a much more stable government situation, where Japan you really don't, and it's really fractured, and you get factions within the different branches, and then you have lots of competition. And I think, and I'll probably get to some more of it. The way the Army got the Navy to sign off on going to war with America was actually very simple, doing all this kind of things. They have, since there is no real central government of Japan, and that's part of what I've been sort of talking about, you have negotiations going on in there, and one of the big things is over this, is steel. That is more of a limitation than is shown up in this game, much more of a limitation than in ICs. It really should be, the concept of Hearts of Iron 3 is this is your limitation on how many ICs you can have. Very few people realize it, but that's what it's designed, so that eventually you run out of energy and you can't build more ICs. That's supposed to be the limiting factor in Hearts of Iron 3. Japan had very limited amounts of steel it could get. And there is a quality element to steel, and I know I've talked about this in the German series, so if you haven't watched that, you can go back and do so. So there's a quality as well as quantity issue with steel. And so they have a limited amount that they're able to bring in. Combination of what's made in... and remember, steel is a product of iron and coal mixed together. You got to go through a manufacturing process. It's not just a mineral resource. In a way, it would almost be worth having iron mines and steel factories as being a separate thing. That, you have iron mines, you have coal mines, you mix coal and iron to build steel. You also use coal to make electrical energy and other heating, to continue to manufacture elements of. Once you have steel, you do use heat afterwards. But if you really wanted to economically model it, but probably more detail than would be good for most players, I would agree with that. But so you have just this big piece of pie of steel coming in, and Japan is after some point is being limited by steel embargoes from the US, and then other countries are steel embargoing them, and then other countries that are not necessarily steel embargoing them but have limited abilities to sell it to them. I'm sort of thinking of the Soviet Union may have more steel and isn't embargoing Japan. I'm not quite sure how much trade there was going on with Japan. I think a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then others, it's just, logistics and getting them to it, and how much is made and what's needed, and what Japan could afford to pay for on the various markets. So you have this steel. So the Japanese Navy needs a lot of steel to build its ships. So they were in negotiations, the Navy minister and the War minister, and, can you support us in going to war with the US? And they're no, we can't do that. Well, what if we increase your steel allotment to X? A really big jump up. Okay, we'll go to war with the US if you increase our steel allotment. That is how they got the Navy's approval to go to war with the US, was giving more steel to the Navy. So, okay, well, we get to install new ministers and shift party factions. Okay, let's take a look. Yes. So he was down here, Hirota, now is up there. We're going to have him do 2 slots. Hirohito, which we will see eventually, and I'll talk about him more later. But he held, was it 4 cabinet posts eventually? Before he was, because I know he was Prime Minister, he was Armaments Minister, and then he was Minister of Education as well, which isn't specifically one of these main slots, but he was Minister of Education, and I think one other department head, but both Minister of Education and, again, I think another department head. He didn't actually run the Ministry of Education. He just was the minister for it, and then the deputy minister or whoever, which is appointed by him, actually did the running of it, but had to get approval for all the major changes or whatever from Tojo, and that's sort of how he accumulated his power, because he had been, I know we will talk much more about it later, had been war minister for a while, and then he moves up to being prime minister, but keeps war minister. And that is an important factor, and in a very big way, it is Tojo who finally stabilizes the Japanese government. Now, of course, sends it down a path of complete and total destruction, but that's a different issue. And we got our reinforcements. Okay, Romania, we give them money for fuel. We got lots of fuel. A little bit of money for a little bit of fuel for Siam, that's fine. I'm very willing to use some level of trade and whatnot to, even stuff we don't need, to do targeted diplomatic action, like with Siam, Tibet, Afghanistan, places that we would prefer to have good relations. Not that we don't want good relations, say, with Finland, but it's not, shall we say, in our main sphere of influence. And I'm sort of kind of hoping some of these guys, like here, to not take their oil, let them stockpile their oil up, and then we come in and take it by capturing their stockpile. Okay, well, I think, yeah, we want to keep these episodes somewhat short, so let's save the game here. And I want to thank you all for watching. I want to thank you for liking the videos. It really does help. And of course, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and post comments, suggestions, corrections, questions. Love hearing from you. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.